Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction, and I hope, and I'm glad you thought this was useful. Let me first start by saying good morning and thank you to all the organizers for inviting us. This is actually really exciting because I just realized there are people here who, people like Geetha and Myra, who may not remember me, but I certainly remember them from before graduate school. They were mentors at ICRW, so it's great to see them again. And of course, my colleagues now, people like Sonald and people like Mark and Susan. So this is actually really nice to be here. I also want to, this is actually work with Mike Wagner that we've been doing for quite a while. So, you know, we're sort of at a stage when we are looking for feedback and from smart people like yourselves to see whether we're even on the right track. So I'm really, I see this as a great opportunity, and I hope the issues that we raise are useful to the larger mission of this panel and also of WEDGE. Just one point about the title. It says Measuring Mothering and Empowerment, and I decided actually in the interest of time and also to be more valuable for this discussion to focus more on the conceptualization and probably less on the technicalities of the measurement, though there is a paper that accompanies this, and I'd be more than happy to share that with you. Just for a little bit of background, I'm a social demographer who primarily works in sub-Saharan Africa and have been working on issues related to family structure, kinship, intergenerational relationships, parenting, and child well-being. And I think throughout this work, this sort of black box of parenting has always struck me as something that needs more work, particularly in the context of gender. So I want to start with just what I think is actually just a truism. All mothers want their children to be healthy and thrive. And I bring this up because I think this is something, this was sort of our starting point. And this is something that I think is true, whether you're in a high income setting, low income setting, in whatever setting you're in. But I think what we are still in need of trying to do is to figure out how does this actually work and what norms are there that are actually guiding mothers to actually do this. And so really what we're sort of interested in is how should we conceptualize and measure how mothers actually do this? And I should just point out that I fully realize that fathers are also part of the story here, but given that it is still a highly gendered practice, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we're limiting this to mothers. So in starting on this, in sort of looking at the literature, I actually started with sort of the US literature, of which there is quite a bit. And there's some excellent work, both recent and more older work, really sort of engaging with critical analysis of scripts of good mothering, particularly along axes of race and class. And this work really raises a number of very, very important concerns and questions about which set of norms are being disseminated and challenged. But I think what strikes me is that does not, at least my reading of it, that this work doesn't explicitly address empowerment per se. And I think there's an assumption that women with the requisite social and economic capital are empowered to follow these scripts of good mothering. And I guess I'm still sort of wondering, so then, is it really empowerment, or is it having the means? Where does empowerment come from for those with and without means? And so this sort of left me asking these kinds of questions. Now, when I shifted to Africa, which is sort of the context I'm more familiar with, what strikes me is that the mothering concept doesn't actually come up very much in the literature, except perhaps for South Africa. And rather, the focus has been very much on empowerment, proxied by decision-making power. And I think there's an assumption that women with high empowerment, high levels of decision-making power, can be effective mothers, and that this is enough to explain variation in these outcomes and out of structure. And indeed, there's tons of evidence to show this on immunization, on nutrition, on any number of outcomes. And I guess we were left with the question, is this enough? Is there value in seeing decision-making power as part of a constellation of norms that supports effective mothering? And so this was kind of this is how we sort of set this up. So maybe to start with, so basically my question is, can we do better? I think we need a more comprehensive measure of mothering that accounts for multiple dimensions, competing norms, and recognizes the limits of empowerment. And by competing norms, I'm really sort of talking about things like the rise in women's education, shifting gender roles that is afoot in pretty much, I think, most countries and certainly all over Africa, and that this is really shifting, in some sense, the scripts of what it is that women are following or not in trying to do this. So mothering, just to, what is it? And I think for me, or for us rather, we define it as the way in which women draw on intrinsic and external resources to rear children. Now, I would love to know what you actually think about that definition, and and I'm completely open to suggestions. But this leads me to sort of suggest a couple of types. There may be mothers who draw on their decision-making power to make optimum use of intrinsic endowments such as education, and also their external resources like public health messaging to care for their kids. There may be women with high levels of power who may be uniquely resourceful and driven to safeguard their children's health despite deficits in education and external resources. And there may be women who lack the power and education literacy, but are exposed to so much health information that they can actually use this to compensate for a dearth in agency. These are all just sort of suggested types. And I think why we should care about this is that I think it does feed into a key question of this panel discussion, which is sort of the measurement of norms around effective mothering. And I think that there is a need to develop a more nuanced understanding of what actually mothers are doing for their children, and understand the mechanisms underlying the relationship between this empowerment and children's well-being. There's something there that is or is not working. For women, I think it is important to try to actually figure this out. And lastly, while improving women's empowerment should certainly be a development goal in itself, I think we need to expand our scope of inquiry to sort of think about these less intuitive and more complicated scenarios that might actually allow us to develop better intervention strategies for both mothers and children. Okay, so what is this? What we're basically doing, I'm treating this as sort of as a proof of concept. And we drew on data from the Mali DHS. And I think for this crowd, everybody's familiar with the demographic health surveys, but we used Mali because it has some of the worst outcomes of child well-being in Africa, and also ranks very low on the Gender Inequality Index. And what we did was, and as I said, let me just repeat all the details of the sampling, everything I can happily share with you, but I'm not going to go into that now. But what we did was basically we conducted a latent class analysis to try to classify mothers in union, because this is what the DHS offers, according to their responses to selected questions on decision-making, education and literacy, and also exposure to health information. So the idea is, can we extract sort of these typologies of mothering based on these kinds of observed characteristics? So what we used was, again, in the DHS, we are all sort of limited by the data we have, not sort of, the data that we wish we had. So these decision-making power questions, I think most of you are familiar with, but they're about making major household purchases, decisions about visits to your family and relatives, how earnings are used, and about decisions about healthcare. Knowledge acquisition, or what I'm calling sort of intrinsic components, educational achievement, literacy, reads newspaper, listens to the radio, and then the health information we picked up on knowledge of family planning, knowledge of HIV/AIDS, and other sexually transmitted infections. And by turning this all into a latent class analysis, which I'm not going to go into the details of, we end up with something that looks like this, which is messy. It's not sort of nice, neat classes that sort of say, hey, this all sort of comes together in these patterns. But what this is actually just showing you are just the probabilities of these different classes of the various items that I just went through. And what might be more useful is to actually see how we're thinking about this, which is that this is sort of the classes that we've kind of come up with, and again, this is all still sort of very much work in progress. So you can think about agentic mothers. These are people who have high decision-making power, but have low education, but have very high exposure to information. You might think about constrained mothers who have low on decision-making power, but high on education and high public health exposure. You could think about another class, something that we're calling passive, where it's really just high on exposure to information and not much else. And then finally, sort of the disadvantage, where essentially have scored low on everything. So this is where, these are sort of the four classes that we've extracted from doing this analysis. And just to see, okay, does this matter? No. So we just ran some models to see, well, does this make a difference for kids' immunization? And this is, controlling for a load of other demographic characteristics, mothers and children in households. And, again, we're still sort of struggling to figure out what's going on here. But I think what's interesting is that it's not the children of agentic mothers, the ones with the high decision-making power that have the highest probabilities of being vaccinated. It's actually the constrained ones. And remember, these are the people who don't have the decision-making power, but high education and public health exposure. And even the passive mothers, the children of passive mothers, are actually even do better as well. So again, these are all just sort of preliminary results and still trying to sort out what's going on. But I think it leads us to sort of some very, very tentative, sort of conclusions where we are, which is that there does seem to be some evidence of these different types of mothering, at least, in the Mali situation. The effects on vaccination of this is somewhat unexpected. And so we're still trying to, try to unpack what might be going on. But I think it raises sort of important questions of the relative role of decision-making power vis-a-vis education and public health campaigns that are actually pushing norms around good mothering. What does it take to be a good mother in these kinds of contexts? And what is it that women are actually using to make the decisions that they are about caring for their kids? And lastly, I think obviously it underscores the need to approach our sort of this question of norms around mothering with more conceptual sophistication and better data. So I think, did I hit my time limit, Catherine?
You are exactly on time. That's very impressive.
Right.
Thank you. And
Okay,
this is a lot